Welcome back to the series on reading biblical poetry. The last video we looked at parallelism. And what we'll be looking at today is, you could say that actually parallelism is a type of what we will be looking at today, which is repetition. In parallelism, you have repetition in two verse sets, in two sections in a verse. But there's much more to repetition in biblical poetry than a parallel verse or parallelism of two verses, two or three verse sets. And this is really, really interesting and really important for us to be able to try and really get into the depths of understanding biblical poetry, because repetition is one of the characteristics, one of the features that we see coming again and again in different ways. So today I want to look in this particular video, and we'll do another video on repetition of a single word or a single concept. And this repetition actually can have various effects as in the text. It can be for emphasis. It can actually present opposites, and hopefully we'll see an example of something in that direction. It can compare when there's a repetition, or it can express continuity and other things as well. And again, I think the important thing for us as we're trying to come to terms with biblical poetry and to understand and let the poetry speak to us is not that we would come to the text with our preconceived ideas of how it should work, but that we should let the text speak to us and develop a sensitivity to let the text speak to us. So when we're looking at repetitions, we're not looking for categories. How does this repetition fit into a certain category that I might have in my mind, or that someone else might have presented? But rather, how does this repetition work in this particular poem, in this particular psalm, in this part of this prophecy which is written poetically? How does this repetition work? What was it doing? What role is it fulfilling, and what message is it giving? So let's look at a few ways that this works. And firstly, repetition in verse sets that are close to one another, repetitions or repetition of a word or a concept or that can come literally one after another within one verse or within a couple of verses. And as an example of this, we'll take Psalm 13, which again is a very powerful psalm, a psalm that I love because of the way that it expresses the psalmist's feeling to God, and the way that within a very, very few verses we see the psalmist in his turning to God comes to a completely different place at the end than he was at the beginning. But at the beginning, this is what he says. For the choir director, a psalm of David. How long, O Lord, will you forget me forever? How long will you hide your face from me? How long shall I take counsel in my soul, having sorrow in my heart all the day? How long will my enemies be exalted? My enemy be exalted over me. So here we have this repetition. How long? It's a cry, it's a shout. This is not just a nice prayer. This is a cry from the heart. And what we see that this repetition does is, firstly, it creates an impression of length of time. He's talking about how long, about length of time. That's what he's talking about. But by repeating it again and again, we also are given the impression of time passing. It seems to the psalmist that this problem that he's in is never going to end. How long will this carry on? How long will this situation be? How long will I be in this situation where my enemy seems to be having the victory over me, where I've got all these ideas of how to get out of it in my heart and I don't know what to do? How long will you hide your face from me? God, that's what I'm feeling right now. How long? So this repetition carries the message, carries the effect of what the psalmist is actually saying, which is, this has just gone on for too long and I can't take it anymore. And the repetition of that cry, how long, just emphasizes that more. But not only that, but it also intensifies it. It's like you can hear the cry getting louder and louder each time he says this and cries out to God, how long? It just gets louder and more intense. So here we see very effective use of repetition within one or two verses where the repetitions are very close to one another and have a very powerful effect. But repetitions don't always come close to each other, and a good example of this is in Psalm 1, where we have a repetition in the beginning and the end of the psalm. So in the beginning of the psalm, we read, "How blessed is the man who does not walk in the counsel of the wicked, nor stand in the path of sinners, nor sit in the seat of scoffers." And then in the last verse we read, "For the Lord knows the way of the righteous, but the way of the wicked will perish." Well, I have to make a little aside here and say that the translation loses the repetition in that the same word is repeated in verse 1, which has been translated the path of sinners, is translated differently in the last verse. It's translated here the way of the righteous. So it's translated in the first verse as path and in the last verse as the way. And here is where I would encourage you both to learn Hebrew, but also to look for tools which can help you with that, like a literal translation, like Young's literal translation can help you there to see the literal translation isn't always, doesn't sound the best, but it will help you as a tool to be able to spot these repetitions that can have a much weight within the poetry. And I would just want to add to that, I'm not blaming the translators here, they do a good job. And it's just a natural, it happens when you're translating, that in some contexts you need to translate into your language in a certain way, and it doesn't always reflect what you have and this is especially in poetry, that is very difficult to reflect the original meaning. So, which is why in these videos I'll be encouraging you to use the tools that are at your disposal to find those things that are actually part of the original language and are important. So here we have this repetition where the first verse talks about the man who's blessed, who does not do these things. And one of the things he does not do is stand in the path of sinners. And then in the last verse, we have a repetition of the word that's translated path or way, derech in Hebrew. And the very last verset we read, "But the way of the wicked will perish." Well, there's a very strong parallel, right, between the way of the wicked and the way of sinners in verse 1, or the path of sinners. So, but that repetition of the path here is actually bringing an end. It's showing us something. It's making a connection where the path of sinners is what we are encouraged not to walk in verse 1, but the way of the wicked, which is parallel to the path of sinners, we now see it in the last words of the psalm, what the end of the way of the sinners is, which is, it will perish. It will have a terrible end. That way will perish. But we see another really interesting thing here, where we have in the first part of that verse, the first verset of that verse, the Lord knows the way of the righteous. So here we also have a comparison by means of repetition of the same word, the way. But now instead of it being the way of the sinner or the way of the wicked, it's the way of the righteous. And it just shows us the comparison between the way of the wicked, which we are encouraged not to walk in verse 1, and we were told the end of in the very, very last words of the song, but now we're told that the way of the righteous, that is the way that the Lord knows. That is the way, and knowing here is that He owns it, He blesses it. So here in this repetition at the beginning and the end of the psalm, we see very beautifully the way that this poetry expresses both a fulfillment, an ending. This is the way that the path of the wicked will end. The way of the wicked will end. It will perish. But we also see this beautiful comparison. But the Lord knows the way of the righteous, and that's the repetition strengthens those things. And here we can take another example of repetition throughout a poem, throughout a psalm, which is very powerful and actually carries to a very large extent the message of the psalm. Here, if we look at Psalm 73, there's a word here that is repeated 3 times. In verse 9, in verse 18, and in the last verse, verse 28. But before we get to that word, I just want to say just a few words about this psalm. This psalm is actually a very powerful psalm, again, of expression to God of what the psalmist is feeling. He is in a dilemma, very serious dilemma, which has brought him to a place of crisis in his faith. He believes that God is good to those who trust in him, to those who walk in his way. But what he sees around him seems to contradict that. What he sees around him is that it's actually not the people who are walking with God who seem to be what we would call blessed, but actually it's those who are going their own way. It's the wicked who seem to be, in what we would, in our terms, blessed. They have a good time. They enjoy themselves. They grow fat, which in biblical terms means they're rich. And it's like he's looking and he's saying, look, God, I'm walking in your way. I'm trying to walk in your way, and look at me and look at them. And they're just doing what they want to do. He gets to the point of crisis so deep that he says, I almost left the way. I almost fell. And at that point, what stops him is firstly the thought that he would offend his brothers. But secondly, that only just kind of stops him from speaking out loud. But the thing that really changes his point of view is coming into the presence of God. And when he comes again into God's presence, he's been looking around him. He's been looking at all these different things. You could say looking at the storm. But now, he turns his eyes back to God. He comes back into God's presence. And immediately, he sees things differently. And he sees what God will do and what actually the end of the people who are going their own way will be. And that brings him back to his, both firstly repenting of his obstinacy and just looking at what is before his nose instead of looking at God, and secondly to his true desire, which is to be in God's presence. That is what the psalm expresses. But here's the very interesting thing. There's a word in Hebrew which is translated to place, shatat, or to a point. It's got different translations. But the first time it appears is in verse 9, where he is describing the wicked. He's describing those who don't walk after God, and he's looking at them and thinking, well, they're having a good time. And what about me? And what about those who are going after you, God? And one of the things he says about these people is they have set their mouths. That word set is this verb, shatat. They have set their mouth against the heavens. or actually in the Hebrew it's in the heavens, which could be against the heavens, and their tongue parades through the earth. So in this verse, what he's saying is that these wicked people, they have set their mouths, in the Hebrew it says in the heavens, or it could be again translated against the heavens, because who is in the heavens? It's the Lord. So they've put their mouths, in a sense, replaced him. And that's very, very much a description of rebellion against God. Here they are rebelling, but it's also a description of their pride. Look, they talk so high. Their mouths are in the heavens. They're talking so high. And look at the lowly who are trying to walk. Look at their lives. So this use of the word here describes the wicked and what they do and their pride. But the next time we come to this verb, it describes what God does. The first time it describes what the wicked are doing. The second time it describes what God does in verse 18. And we'll read verse 17, because verse 17 describes the turning point for the psalmist. He says, I had this problem, and I didn't know what to do, and I didn't know how to express myself, and it was such a problem until. And verse 17 tells us what this until was. Until I came into the sanctuary of God, then I perceived their end. When he came into God's presence, it changed his perspective completely. He saw that what he'd been looking at, the waves, the people who were being so proud and going their own way, and seeing their success and seeing their lives, their enjoyment, and that's what he's looking at. But now he comes into God's presence and he looks at God, and it completely changes his view of reality. He now sees reality from God's perspective. And what he says about it now in the next verse is what God will do. And again, this word set is repeated. Surely you set them in slippery places. You cast them down to destruction. Can you imagine being put on a slide which has oil on it, where once you're on that slide you cannot get off? But that's what it says God is doing to the wicked. He will do. This is the end game. So what is happening now to the psalmist is, in God's presence, his eyes are open to see the end game, to see the punchline, to see what God will do. It's not the end of the story what he's saying. It's not the true reality. Seems to him reality, that's what he can see, but it's not the true reality. When he comes into God's presence, he sees. Again, he's reminded of who God is and what he will do. And God will set them in slippery places. And their end will be destruction. That's the second time it appears. The third time this word appears is in the very last verse, where now, after coming back to this place of being in God's presence, of repenting, saying, I was just like an animal before you with no understanding, but now I'm coming back to what my true desire. And here he describes his true desire in verse 28, the last verse. He says, but as for me, the nearness of God is my good. The presence of God, the nearness of God is my good. I have made the Lord my refuge. And here again we have this issue of the translation, where the word made here is the same word as is translated in the other verses that we read as set. I have set my refuge in the Lord. Or I've set in the Lord my refuge. So what he's basically saying, that I may tell of your works. He's basically saying, I've made you the one I trust, God. But it's a repetition of this word, set. And here we have this really powerful comparison of each of the characters in this psalm. Verse 9, the wicked, who set their mouths in the heavens or against the heavens. Verse 18, the Lord, who will set the wicked in slippery places, that they will go down to destruction. And verse 28, the psalmist himself, who sets the Lord as his true high tower, as his trust. And that's basically the story of the psalm and what the psalm is saying. So here in the repetition of a word, we actually have, in a nutshell, what the psalmist is saying. So again, I would encourage you to develop a sensitivity to these repetitions. Use the tools that you have, and just get deeply into this word and see how beautiful and powerful it is. So hope to see you in the next video.